In the cold halls of Berlin during the winter of 1884, leaders from the most powerful Western nations gathered around a polished table, not to discuss peace in Europe, but to divide a continent they barely understood. These men, dressed in the finest garments of the day, sat with maps and rulers, drawing lines across a land they had never visited, slicing through mountains, rivers, cultures, and communities, all in the name of avoiding conflict among themselves. But what about the people who actually lived in Africa? The kings, the chiefs, the farmers, the poets, the traders. None of them had a seat at this infamous table. The very people who had shaped Africa for centuries were denied a voice in deciding its future. In fact, they were not even considered part of the conversation. Africa wasn't seen as a continent of civilizations. It was treated like a cake to be cut and served. What happened in Berlin that year changed everything. The consequences of that so-called conference are still felt today, etched into the borders that fuel conflict, reflected in the economic systems that still bleed African resources dry, and seen in the political chaos that continues to plague many nations across the continent. So here's a question for you. How can a continent move forward when its very foundations were built on a deal made without its consent? Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure you subscribe to Africa Info Hub, the channel that uncovers Africa's hidden history, current affairs, and powerful leaders shaping the continent's future. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a chance to know the real story. The infamous Berlin Conference was held between November 1884 and February 1885 in Germany's capital. But don't be misled, it wasn't a peaceful summit aimed at helping Africa develop. It was a cold, calculated meeting organized by Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, to address rising tensions among European powers that were racing to claim African territory. By the late 19th century, European countries were growing increasingly competitive. The Industrial Revolution had created an urgent demand for raw materials, cheap labor, and new markets. Africa, rich in natural resources and vulnerable to European weaponry, became the perfect target. But as the competition for African land intensified, so did the risks of war between European countries. To avoid such a disaster, Bismarck proposed the Berlin Conference under the guise of creating order and cooperation. In reality, it was about slicing up Africa to satisfy European appetites, all while pretending to act in the name of civilization. 14 countries showed up to the conference, major colonial powers like Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy, as well as others like Spain, the Netherlands, and even the United States. The goal was simple: avoid European conflict by clearly defining who would control which parts of Africa. But who was missing from this historic meeting? The very people who lived in Africa. No African kingdom, leader, or representative was invited, not even consulted. It was as if the people of Africa did not exist. This was not diplomacy. This was domination. Africa was reduced to a blank slate, a giant piece of land to be divided like spoils of war. The rich cultures, kingdoms, and histories were ignored. Entire civilizations were dismissed as irrelevant. The message was clear. Africa belonged to those who could take it, not to those who called it home. Out of this conference came the General Act of Berlin, a document that would formalize the theft of an entire continent. One of the core principles was the principle of effective occupation. This meant that if a European power wanted to claim African territory, it had to prove it could control it militarily and administratively. This led to a brutal scramble. European nations rushed into Africa, planting flags, building outposts, and waging war, often against peaceful communities, to satisfy this new rule. The act also promoted so-called free trade and free navigation of rivers like the Congo and the Niger, but only for European powers. These clauses weren't designed to help Africa. They were put in place to guarantee smooth extraction of resources like ivory, gold, rubber, and more. Trade routes were protected, but African interests were crushed. The borders they drew paid no attention to African geography, culture, or tribal territories. They were based on convenience and greed. Within just 30 years of the Berlin Conference, over 90% of Africa was under colonial rule. This colonization wasn't just political, it was economic, social, and psychological. The borders created were completely arbitrary, forcing different ethnic and linguistic groups into the same countries, while splitting other communities across multiple borders. This chaotic division laid the groundwork for decades of conflict. Civil wars, tribal violence, and political instability all stemmed from those careless lines drawn in Berlin. Nations were left fractured, unity became difficult, and self-governance nearly impossible. Colonial powers exploited African labor and resources to enrich themselves. Mines were dug, forests cleared, rivers redirected, all with little regard for environmental or human consequences. Schools taught European history, while African heritage was suppressed. Governance structures were built to control, not empower. To this day, many African countries struggle with weak institutions, fragile economies, and fractured national identities, because the foundations they inherited were never meant to serve Africans. Perhaps the most horrifying example of this colonial nightmare is the Congo Free State, which was not even a colony of Belgium, but the personal property of King Leopold II. Yes, one man owned the territory 76 times the size of Belgium. Under Leopold's brutal rule, millions of Congolese were enslaved, tortured, and killed in the name of rubber production. Villages were burned, hands were chopped off as punishment, and families were torn apart. This was no ordinary exploitation, it was a genocide. The natural beauty and biodiversity of Congo were ravaged, forests were emptied, rivers polluted. Leopold grew rich. Europe applauded his civilizing mission. But the people of Congo suffered one of the darkest chapters in African history, one that is rarely taught in schools, even today. And yet the legacy of Leopold's horror still shapes Congo's fate. From continued political instability to violent militias and corrupt systems of governance, the damage done by one man's greed remains deeply rooted. The legacy of the Berlin Conference is not confined to history books. It breathes through the struggles and aspirations of modern Africa. The unnatural borders drawn in 1884, lines that ignored ethnic groups, cultures, and ancient kingdoms, still fuel many of today's conflicts, from the Congo to Cameroon, Nigeria to South Sudan. These weren't accidents of history. They were deliberate acts of division meant to weaken unity and ensure European dominance. Africa's continued reliance on exporting raw materials like gold, cocoa, oil, and coffee is no coincidence. It reflects an economic system built not to develop the continent, but to extract from it. Even after independence, most African nations inherited economies structured to serve outsiders, not their own people. The system was never designed to empower Africans. It was built to keep them dependent, divided, and disoriented. But perhaps the most devastating impact is psychological. Generations were told their cultures were inferior, their traditions uncivilized, their languages unworthy. Colonialism didn't just conquer land. It tried to conquer the African mind, and the struggle to rebuild self-worth, reclaim identity, and tell Africa's own story remains one of the greatest challenges of our time. Yet, this is not a tale of defeat. It is a story of survival, resilience, and awakening. Understanding what happened in Berlin isn't just about learning history. It's about reclaiming power. It's about seeing how Africa was broken, so it can finally heal and rise. So here's the question. If the past was taken from us without consent, what will it take to reclaim our future? If this story moved you, challenged you, or opened your eyes, then join us on Africa Info Hub. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. This is more than a channel. It's a movement to restore truth and pride in Africa's story. The more we know, the stronger we become.